My name is Seth Mercer, and I want to tell you something about what happens when two people sit down together without an agenda. Not a negotiation, not an assessment, not an interrogation, or a briefing, or any of the structured conversations that happen between species in the outer belt when there is something specific at stake. Just two people in a room with time and honesty, and the willingness to use both. Those conversations are rarer than you would think, and they change things in ways that the structured ones never quite manage. The room was a small lounge on the outer ring of Station Karath 7, the kind of room that exists on every station in the belt for the purpose of giving people somewhere to be that is not their quarters, and not their quarters, and not their workstation. Two chairs, a viewport, and a machine in the corner that produced something warm in a cup if you pressed the right combination of buttons. I had been pressing the wrong combination for 3 days before I found the right one. Fleet Admiral Voss Sale found me there on my 4th evening on the station, which I later understood was not an accident. She had been on the station for 6 hours on a transit stop between operations, and she had apparently been told there was a human on the crew rotation and had decided she wanted to see one. She stood in the doorway of the lounge for a moment before she came in, which gave me time to see her clearly before she introduced herself. She was everything her rank suggested. Tall and precise with the dark skin and silver markings of the Valdorian command bloodlines, wearing her uniform with the ease of someone who had worn it for so long it had become a second skin. Her eyes were a deep amber, and they moved across the room with the habitual assessment of someone who had spent a career reading spaces before entering them. She looked at me, looked at the cup in my hand, looked at the machine in the corner. She said she had heard the machine was difficult. I said button 4, then 2, then 7. Then wait for the second light before pressing 8. She tried it. It worked. She sat down in the other chair with her cup and looked out the viewport at the outer belt moving past in the dark and did not say anything for a moment. I did not say anything for a moment. I did not fill the silence because some silences were worth sitting in, and this felt like one of them. She said she had been commanding fleet operations for 23 years. I said that was a long time. She said she had encountered most species in the outer belt in that time. In negotiations, in conflict, in the various arrangements that formed and dissolved between factions across the zone. She said she had never had a conversation with a human. I said that surprised me a little. She said the human outer colonies were at the edge of her operational zone. Contacts had been formal and brief. She had read the assessments. She had the census data. She had the contact histories. She said none of them had prepared her for this. I said for what? She looked at me. She said for someone sitting in a lounge at the end of a shift drinking something from a machine that does not work properly and looking like the whole situation is completely fine. I said the machine works fine once you know the sequence. She said that is not what I mean. I looked at her. She said every species I have encountered in 23 years comes to interactions with context. With the weight of history between our factions, with positions and interests and the awareness of what is at stake and how the conversation goes. She said, you are sitting here with none of that. I said I am sitting here with a cup of something warm and a viewport, and a Tuesday evening with nowhere particular to be. That is a good situation. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, is that a human trait? The ability to be in a situation without the weight of the situation. I thought about it honestly. I said, not exactly. Humans carry weight. We carry a great deal of it. We are not unburdened people. But we have a long practice of putting the weight down when we are not actively using it. Of being in a moment without making the moment carry everything that came before it. She said, why? I said, because we learned a long time ago that the weight does not go anywhere when you put it down. It is still there when you pick it back up. But the moment you are in, right now, only happens once, and if you are carrying the weight through it, you miss the moment. She was quiet. She looked out at the belt, and I let her look because she was thinking about something. And thinking deserved its space. After a while, she said she had been commanding fleet operations for 23 years, and she had not taken a conversation without an agenda in longer than she could remember. I said, what was her agenda tonight? She said she had wanted to see a human. I said, that is a pretty light agenda. She almost did something with her expression. She said she had expected something different. I said, what had she expected? She thought about it. She said the assessments described humans as unpredictable, difficult to read, operating on emotional frameworks that did not translate cleanly into strategic analysis. I said that is fair in parts. She said the contact histories described human representatives as informal and resistant to hierarchical framing. I said also fair. She said she had expected to find all of those things and to find them difficult. I said had. She looked at me. She said she had found someone who knew the correct button sequence for a broken machine and was willing to share it without being asked. I said the machine is not broken. It just has a unusual sequence. She said you fixed it for yourself and then gave the fix to the next person who needed it. I said yes. She said without being asked. I said it seemed like the obvious thing to do. She was quiet for a moment. She said, in 23 years of fleet command, she had managed the sharing of tactical and strategic information through formal processes with specific protocols and defined parameters. She said nobody had ever just given her something useful because it seemed like the obvious thing to do. I said that is a hard way to operate. She looked at me sharply. I said not as a criticism, as an observation. Managing everything through formal processes is exhausting because formal processes have weight, and you are carrying the weight of every process all the time. She was quiet. I said the machine sequence is just a machine sequence. It is not strategic information. It does not change the balance of anything. Keeping it seemed worse than sharing it. She said most of what I manage is not like a machine sequence. I said no, but some of it probably is, and you are applying the same framework to all of it. She looked at me steadily. She said you have been on the station 4 days. I said yes. She said you are on a junior crew rotation posting. I said yes. She said you just told a fleet admiral that her operational framework might be overcomplicated. I said I told you that some of what you manage might not need the same framework as the rest of it. That is a smaller claim. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said something I had not expected. She said she had made a decision 3 months ago that she had not been certain of since. A resource allocation decision that it involved formal processes and strategic analysis and input from 4 separate advisory councils and had still not felt right when she made it and had not felt right in the 3 months since. She said she had not told anyone that it did not feel right because the process had been correct and the analysis had been sound and the advisories had concurred, and saying it did not feel right in that context was not something fleet admirals said. She said she was telling me now and she was not sure why. I said because I am a human on a junior crew rotation drinking something from a machine in a lounge on a Tuesday evening, and the weight of what I think about your decision is approximately 0, and that makes it a safe thing to say out loud. She looked at me. I said sometimes you need to say something out loud to someone who is not carrying the weight of it before you can hear what you actually think about it. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewport, the outer belt moved in its slow, indifferent way, and the lounge was warm, and the cups were getting cold, and the station ran its quiet systems around us. She said the decision was about patrol resource allocation in the outer Dravosi zone. She said the formal process had recommended a specific distribution that optimized coverage across the most strategically significant corridors. She said what had not felt right was that the distribution left 3 lower priority corridors, with patrol gaps that were acceptable by strategic assessment, but that she knew from 23 years of operational experience were exactly the kind of gaps that got used by exactly the kind of actors who paid attention to gaps. I said, did you say that in the advisory process? She said she had raised it. I said what happened. She said the assessment criteria did not support prioritizing those corridors, and the advisories had been unanimous, and she had signed the allocation. I said, but you still think the gaps are a problem? She said yes. I said, then they are probably a problem. She looked at me. I said, 23 years of operational experience is not nothing. It is a pattern recognition system that has been running longer than the assessment criteria have existed. When it says something the assessment criteria does not say, that is information. She said the process exists to remove individual judgment from decisions that affect too many people to trust to individual judgment. I said the process is built from accumulated individual judgments. The assessment criteria were written by people who use their operational experience to decide what to measure. Your 23 years are the same kind of thing. She was very quiet, the kind of quiet that meant something was working. I did not feel it. After a long time, she said she was going to request a supplementary review of the 3 corridor allocations. She said it would require reopening a closed decision, which was not a small thing. I said no. She said it would raise questions about her confidence in the original process. I said probably. She said she was going to do it anyway. I said I think that is right. She looked at me one more time with those amber eyes that had 23 years of decisions in them, and something new alongside them that had 23 years of decisions in them, and something new alongside them. She said, Seth Mercer. I said yes. She said, you have been on this station 4 days. I said yes. She said, you are a junior crew rotation posting with no strategic rank or advisory function. I said correct. She said, "This conversation does not exist in any formal record." I said, "No." She said, "But it changed something." I looked at her. I said, "I just listened." "You did the changing." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she stood and smoothed her uniform with the habit of 23 years and picked up her cold cup and looked at it once. She said, "Button 4. Then 2. Then 7. I said, "Then wait for the second light before pressing 8. She nodded once. He said, "Safe travels, Seth Mercer." I said, "Safe travels, Admiral." She walked out of the lounge, and I sat for a while longer in the chair by the viewport and watched the outer belt and thought about weight and what you could do when you put it down for a moment and what happened when two people sat in a room without an agenda and just talked honestly. It changed things. Not loudly, not dramatically, but it changed things. That was enough. It was always enough.